Hello everybody, welcome. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land, the people of the Kulin Nation, of the land on which we meet today, and pay my respects to elders past and present. So welcome to your Studio Boo and you. This is a dating show where we leave no stone unturned in our quest for the perfect work-life balance. Unlike most dating shows, the contestants, well, maybe like most dating shows, most of the contestants are pretty terrible. There's no resolution, and no one goes on a date afterwards, but considering some dates I've had, I'm going to call that a win. Let's see if this will behave. Excellent. Okay, so a little bit about me. So I am your host for today. I'm a producer at Ultimerse, an indie studio in West Melbourne, as well as doing production. I work across biz dev, marketing, and community management. If any of you are not sure what a producer does, sometimes it looks like this, sometimes it looks like this, sometimes this, but most of the time it's me talking to our wonderful team like this. I hope not too often, but definitely often enough. Okay, so I studied communications at university. I actually didn't do a games degree at any point. I started out actually doing psychology as well, because I was always interested in people and the way in which we communicate with one another and work together, and sometimes have difficulty working together as well. I worked at Apple for a time. If you ask me about an iCloud issue, I will pretend that I have fainted, because I can't do it again. But it was a great experience getting to meet so many different people from so many different places and understanding them in a really short space of time. When I started with Ultimerse, I started in a marketing role. So it was my job, obviously, to promote the brand, promote the products that we were working on, which was Paperfill Panic. We just released, go and get it on Steam. And from there, I found that I was getting involved in a lot of conversations about the business itself. So what our goals were, what our business plans were, and where we wanted to be from where we were at that point in time. And I find that when you're in a startup culture, these questions are the ones that are always getting asked. But often the feeling of your space and the way that you feel when you come to work every day is the last thing that comes up. And before you know it, it's kind of grown this culture of its own. So, what are we going to learn today? So we're going to learn what studio culture is, how does it grow, and how to impact it. This is going to be mostly looking at a relatively introductory level, but hopefully there's something in there for everyone. And it's definitely aimed at leaders. So if you are a leader in this room, if you are a leader at a studio, or you have the potential to impact change, I want you to listen very carefully. But wait, what is studio culture? What is this nefarious, nebulous thing that I've heard floating around and that everyone keeps telling me is really important? So just like at some point you would have learned the birds and the bees from a family member, friend, or deep dark corners of the internet, at some point somebody's probably explained relationships to you in one way or another. So to improve your relationship with your studio boo, first of all you need to understand what you're striving for and what it's all about. Obviously these conversations come with a big grain of salt in terms of the privilege that you might have in the place that you're working. The privilege that you have to take certain jobs or to turn down certain jobs. So that's something that we need to be keeping in mind when we're having these discussions. But studio culture is all about the management and cultivation of the relationship you have with your work, your co-workers or your boss. I really hope this isn't me. And yourself, which we often forget. So every workplace that you are going to be at throughout the entire course of your life is now your boo. And you can see these boos represented with our friendly little ghosts here. Every studio is like a partner, and some partners you're with for a couple of months, some you're with for years, and some for life. The likelihood of something in your life happening while you're working at one of these places, whether that's a huge life event or something that you could have never anticipated, is most likely going to happen. You're going to learn things both internally at work and externally while you are at these places. You're going to be happy, you're going to be sad, and it's really important that you have enough of a relationship with your employer or with your staff that you can have conversations about those things and feel supported. Think about it this way. Relationships most of the time happen relatively naturally. You meet someone, you get to know them, you're like, this person is the best thing ever and I want to know them and love them forever. But who hasn't fallen into a quasi-relationship at some point that's been really unclearly defined and you don't really know what they're doing and you don't really know how each of you feel, and it's like, they're not texting you back and I just don't know. And that's ended up causing you maybe a couple of problems, maybe just a few. How did that work out? And if it worked out really well, please just, because you'll ruin my statistics, and that's... But who creates it? Every single person that you interact with. I know it sounds broad, we're going to dive in a little bit deeper, but whether people in your team are local, whether they're remote, whether they work with you one day a week, whether they are working every day of the week, can impact culture. And that includes your clients as well. Team, leaders, customers, clients. But who can shape it? So this is where your managers, your directors, your CEOs, your producers, your leaders in the industry have the opportunity to shape these cultures. Anyone that actually has the privilege to do so. Ultimately, it is the responsibility of management to ensure that everyone is set up to do the best job that they can in the environment that they have. But why does it matter? So studio culture is a little bit like mold. And some molds are good. Penicillin is a mold. You know, I'm not hating on mold here. But some arts are good. The day that you open your doors as a studio, it might not yet exist. But suddenly it's grown out of some strange little corners of your working life. Sometimes it's toxic mold. And as these things build up, and if you leave them unattended, it can grow and grow and grow until you realise you need help finding the studio amongst the thorns, or mold. So to get us thinking about what we want in our studio, let's meet some boos. So this is boo number one. Boo number one isn't always on the same page as you, but does their best to understand. Boo doesn't really love you spending all your time with other people and wants your attention a lot of the time. They think you need to sink all your spare time into the relationship in order for it to be successful. Let's meet boo number one. To an outsider, that immediately might raise some red flags. Might not sound like a great relationship. But it's not always black and white to the individual, depending on their experiences. Depending on their history, that might seem totally normal or even better than somewhere that they've come from before. Maybe they're only like that once a week. Maybe they only demand all your time when things are really busy for them and they need extra support, which might sound a little familiar. They like dogs. Brew number two. So brew number two is pretty kind to you and nice enough to your loved ones. You fundamentally disagree on a few little bits and pieces. So for example, brew two can say some pretty thoughtless things at times, maybe occasionally a little bit sexist. Is that a big enough deal for you to end the relationship? What if it's intermittent? What if everything else is perfect except for that? Loves walks on the beach, hates sand. It's coarse, gets everywhere. And boo number three. Boo number three is loving and supportive. They want you to spend time with your family and friends. They have their own goals and need support, but they encourage you to pursue your passions, as well as helping with theirs. Boo 3 still has their quirks and does some things that might annoy you, but nothing particularly groundbreaking. Boo 3 is also a big fan of LARPing. Just from those descriptions, who would you want to partner with? The answer is not one, because dogs don't cure everything. Only most things, most of the time. Okay, so obviously I'm oversimplifying a little bit. But throughout the course of your life, you're going to spend more time at work than you are at home. So you need a boo that lets you have a comfortable work-life balance, that supports your mental and physical health, and that encourages you to become the best version of yourself that you can be. No boo or studio, in case you haven't connected the two, is ever perfect or without its quirks. So what impacts these categories and how do we shape them? So the work. So your work should make you feel like emoji spamming heart eyes to your friends. Maybe not all the time, but most of the time. The more engaged you are with your work, the better you're going to feel. And the more likely you are to want to put time in within your space. When you go to an interview, before you've even gotten the job, you need to start to listen really carefully about what is expected of you. Are you going to be challenged in a positive way? Does the work sound fresh and exciting? It's the saddest gift. He says he doesn't miss his mum because he's off at camp, and then it's very sad. Does the work sound fresh and exciting? Ask how many people have been in the role before you, why the role's come up. Has it been 400 people? Is it a stormtrooper base? Because that's the only reason that there should be 400 people that have gone through that role before you. You need to also make sure you're asking the right questions. Challenge both the work and the culture fit. If the expectation seems to be that you're going to do a certain kind of work and nothing but that for 6 years, or there's no sense of progression, or there's nowhere that you can grow and learn from in future, you're probably going to find yourself burnt out and bored of that boo pretty quickly. You can get a pretty good idea of what culture to expect before you even take a job. Obviously, you need a job. You're going to need to be able to support yourself, so your room to move is going to vary at all times. However, this is the time when you need to be a little bit selfish because no one is going to do it for you. You need to be able to push to be paid what you're worth. You need to be able to have room to negotiate and set clear next steps with who you're talking to. Ultimately, maybe they don't have room to move on things like pay. Obviously, in an industry like we have, when you're a startup, there's not a whole lot of room in that space sometimes. But you need to be able to have the conversation, and that's what that is about. Let's say you get given a contract and you don't understand the legalese in it. A lot of businesses sometimes try and provide contracts that are really hefty and scary, and especially if you're fresh out of uni, you're going to be staring at that going, I have no idea what I'm reading, but I'm going to nod and smile, so I look like I do. If the business isn't willing to explain the finer details of that contract to you, or negotiate on it, or set clear clauses that you both agree on, that should be a red flag. Protect yourself, protect your future, and test the business. Make sure those conversations are welcomed and transparent, not taboo and feared. No matter what the job is, there's probably going to be parts of it that you don't love doing. Relationships as well are hard work. But something that I say when friends ask for relationship advice is the same that I say when they ask for work advice. You need to be having more good days than bad days. If you find that you are starting to dread coming in every day, or you think about it and you go, and you get a little bit of that feeling, you need to listen to that. You should be able to honestly and openly communicate about the bad days and expect that the business is going to work just as hard to accommodate you as you do to work on the things that they need and work on yourself. I just opened all my slides somehow. Magic. All right, so your studio's culture informs the work. It's a two-way street. Multiple studies have been done on the relationship between work environment and productivity. In organisations with low employee engagement scores, they experienced 18% lower productivity, 16% lower profitability, 37% lower job growth, and 65% lower share price over time. I think we can all agree that is 100% the worst. Beyond the business statistics that these experiences impact, there is a huge mental and emotional toll to working in a negative culture. Something that I say when I speak to other leaders at businesses is that you need to be prepared to adjust what you can change and acknowledge what you can't. They might be simple fixes. It might be something as simple as office temperature, open plan. Some people work better in noisy spaces, some don't. And working out what you can modify to make people's environment more comfortable and to enhance their focus. An artist might need a different light level to a programmer. Some people work better collaboratively. You can't get the best from people or from your studio if you don't have conversations about how your team works best. If you're in that position of guidance, provide survey opportunities, ask the questions, anonymously or confidentially. Don't just ask for the feedback, be ready to act on it. Be ready to allocate resources and time to improving the environment. I'm not saying any of this is easy, and it takes a huge amount of time, but it is so important in terms of retaining your team. Always be surveying their engagement. Stop asking them to tell you what they think, and instead ask them how they feel. Darcy Smith did a talk last year on community from League of Geeks, if you're not aware. And what he said has stuck with me in general. You can argue with opinions, but you can't argue with someone's feelings. And I think that applies not only to your consumers, but to your team. You can't tell someone, well, no, you don't feel that way. Don't be silly, because they're already feeling it, and you need to be ready to listen. So there is a great talk about game development workspaces. It's a GDC talk that's available for free on YouTube by Dimitri Datsaridis. It goes into more detail about improving work output by analysing different workspaces and how they impacted or improved on the output created. I highly recommend watching it because it's something that you often don't think about as well, but that is something that does impact culture. By improving the environment, you're showing that you care about what your team's needs are. It also improves their relationship with management, the business, and the work being done, because then obviously they're more comfortable. Surveys are easy to create and to keep anonymous and to gauge those feelings. There are even more employee satisfaction programs out there now. I will admit I haven't used these specific ones, and I don't think you necessarily have to pay to get it done, other than in time. There's one called Tiny Pulse that will ask your employees a random question every week. It might be, how do you feel about the noise level in the office? It might be, how do you feel about your work this week? You want questions that are vague enough that it's easy to answer, but targeted enough that you can actually action a result from them. Studies do show that consistent check-ins with employees leads to higher engagement in their work. If you want a good basis, I am going to tweet out all of these links after this talk so that they're nice and easy to find. But there's an article from a company called Culture Amp, and they talk about the psychology behind asking specific questions and some of the best questions to ask. But remember the mold. If you don't ask, you can't know. All of this is aiming to reach flow. Now, if any of you have studied psych at any point, you've probably heard of Mihai. So Mihai Csikszentmihalyi was a psychologist that talks about a state of flow that people enter when they're doing work they love. There's a whole bunch of different terms. You might call it in the zone or focused, and time seems to fly, and everything feels really balanced, and you know what you're doing, and you love what you're doing, and it gets done really quickly and really well. It's being able to work at something that's challenging, but not impossible, exciting but not overwhelming, and that has an obvious and visible impact or output. So, when it comes to the work, you want to be able to set clear goals for your team. This goes for every individual team member as well as overall, and make them obvious. However you choose to plan your work, whether you're doing an agile or Kanban or however you do that, keep them in the forefront of people's minds and celebrate them. Let people feel like they have immediate feedback as they're hitting those small goals. You want to keep a balance between challenge and skills. Not only does this help you work out where you need to upskill members of your team to make them feel more comfortable or to help them reach flow, but it reduces the likelihood of team members feeling frustrated or disappointed with the work they're creating. Exclude distractions wherever possible. I always encourage people to work in the way they feel most comfortable. If you know that you get more work done listening to music and you can communicate that, that's something that you can work around as long as they're ready to join those conversations as a team when you have them. You need to be able to work with your managers to have the freedom to do this at times so that you can truly focus and get work done the best way that you do. Reduce or remove the pressure of failure on team members. Especially at a newer studio, it can be really scary if you feel like you've made a mistake on something. By letting team members have the freedom to experiment, test, make mistakes along the way, you allow them to work in a freer, more open state of mind, which removes that self-consciousness that might stop them from doing something really creative. Frequently open your communication channels. Whether you're doing surveys, whether you're doing weekly reviews, whether you're doing check-ins once a month, however works best for you and your team, make sure that you keep it consistent. If you can achieve those elements, good things will come. Remember when we talked about it being a two-way street? When you do work you love, a positive feedback loop is created. Energy allows you to complete more work more efficiently, creating a greater feeling of success and achievement along the way, which does mean better things for the studio as a whole as well. By ensuring that you're providing an environment for your employees to enter that state of flow and removing the negative feelings, you can contribute to a greater output and experience. But part of your responsibility is not just saying these things. You need to get your plans down on paper. Nothing means anything if it's not in writing. Ask anyone who has ever been burned by a verbal yes or no. and it differs from studio to studio, but it's important to ask those questions. Navi Brower created a great studio handbook template as a guide, especially if you're a producer, and I'm sure there are some in this room, in that awkward netherworld between executive team and dev team. You need to be pushing these questions to those who can make the final decisions. Uncertainty around things like sick leave, carers leave, annual leave, working hours can make people incredibly stressed and unable to enjoy their daily role. The more that you set process, just like you would discuss needs in a relationship, the more you allow it to frame culture and clearly define the roles, responsibilities, and expected behaviours. All these things can happen when your employee comes in for their first day. So for example, Non-Binary Zone, which is a great resource, recommends asking for pronouns prior to an interview. That's something that might seem really small to a lot of people, but it makes a huge impact on that person's ability to feel comfortable. Ask if there's anything you can do to ensure that that workplace is going to be more supportive. It's up to you to educate yourself on what other people might need as a leader and adjust it accordingly. The lack of clarity as to how discipline is handled, or if people are being treated differently from one to another, can cause toxicity and resentment to grow, and that's a lot harder to crawl back from. So you need those things down in writing in that handbook as well to show what is absolutely not tolerated and what is. Routine can be really helpful for teams to work across if they find themselves unsure of where to start. So if you can give them every other bit of information when they're starting out, so that they don't have to ask those questions, they're going to settle into the work routine much more comfortably. Just like any relationship though, if you do start scheduling your time down to the minutes, your partner's pretty quickly going to want to kill you. So there needs to be some flexibility, but a clear framework can help a lot. Also, seek out content that tells you you're doing it wrong. Steal, beg, borrow from every other discipline you can, and I'm not just talking in games. You need to read and watch everything. Human resources information, psychology, team building, development cycle processes. All of those contribute to shaping a positive studio culture. It's up to you to ensure that you're up to date with how to best influence your team to achieve, and you need to be proactive in trying new things and shaping process to fit if it isn't working. This is part of that adaptive management style that you really do need to embrace, being ready to accept that there is a better way and taking active steps to achieve it. Your co-workers. Just like any partner you have, you're not always going to like their friends. Ideally, a boo that's interested in the same things as you and has similar opinions on what is and isn't acceptable is going to bring people around that uphold the same values. But it's not always the case. There's always a chance that you're going to have to work with people you don't necessarily get along with. Let's say your boo has bad breath. It's awful. Some days it's fine, and others you want to hide from them and avoid them. A bad co-worker can be quite similar to bad breath. It doesn't define the place that you work at or your partner, but it hangs around, makes days worse, and can be hard to escape sometimes. This is where you either need to find a way to get your boo's teeth brushed, get them chewing some gum, or confront them about their own hygiene. Hygiene's culture. Spoiler alert. There's a big difference between feeling physically unwell, threatened, assaulted, compared to just not feeling it when it comes to your interactions with a coworker. And it's important that if it's the previous, that this is escalated as quickly as possible, if possible. If you're in a position where you feel this way and you don't feel like you have the support of HR or your workplace, then you need to look at reaching out to family, friends, external workplace support, or HR resources or police. Like in real life, it is not always easy to just leave. You are relying on an income, and some places will abuse this. Maybe your workplace or its employees are making you feel like you don't have the skills to be successful or forcing extreme hours on you. Make sure you educate yourself on the resources you have and take small steps to move towards improving your situation as best you can while keeping yourself as safe as possible. Now, some of you might be thinking, but that's about individuals though, that's not really culture. Well, in case it hasn't been clear, individuals and their decisions are what makes up that culture. Studio culture is the main reason people leave games. Games is already a difficult industry. We face closures, retention issues, stability, pay, lack of support networks, lack of understanding, the demonisation of games sometimes in the media. When you add poor culture to this, the industry can become almost unbearable. I'm, all things considered, relatively new to the industry and have heard so many stories of poor treatment, exploitation, sexism, work without pay, work without credit, These aren't uncommon things, and they all come down to studio culture and the culture of the industry that maintains a status quo in order to continue to underpay in an attempt to make profit in a difficult commercial space. Now, I'm sure a lot of you heard about Rockstar. I'm not going to go deep into details about what did or didn't happen or how many hours they work. What I want to talk about is the actual response. I think it's great also to acknowledge that Rockstar staff have been able to come out and speak, but while employed, we have to acknowledge that the power dynamic is still with the leaders and the team can't speak as freely as they might like. I don't know if your parents ever said to you, if you can't say anything nice, don't say anything at all, but that is a very common case at times. But what I want you to see is the reaction to this sort of information. So devs have started to respond negatively. The media covered it negatively. These things are starting to reflect on your studio. Oh, but consumers don't care. Like, we're just going to keep making the games and people are still going to buy it. And you're probably right that they will. But who is going to make your games for those consumers when all your experienced devs are burned out and leave the industry? If you don't want to do these things for the sake of your team, if you think it's a slightly naive, utopic dream, that's your prerogative. But recognise that this is something that can be changed. The more studios stand up and condemn these cultures and treat their teams better. Better attention leads to better teams, leads to better work. And consumers are starting to care. So what if you can't change it? What if you can't escalate it? What if the problem is your manager or director or a stakeholder? You need to have a conversation with yourself about your lines, what you are willing and not willing to stand for. And again, this all plays into the privilege that you have. What would you walk out for? Internally, externally. Have that conversation with yourself and have it frequently. Of course, you need to be able to assess the money that you can afford to lose or not afford to lose, and the role that you have and the network that you have and the safety net that you have. But the role that you occupy defines what your lines are and what they can be. Make the lines for others if you have the privilege to do so. Step forward, know early. Make plans before harassment happens. Let there be no confusion between your team and the outside world as to what your approach is and your stance is. We've seen it so many times this year and previous. We're seeing friends being let go over and over again. We're seeing treatment of staff being set by the consumer. We're seeing studios afraid to speak up or stand up, or worse, bowing into the demands of the mob mentality. And we're blessed to see our community rally in these times, but that doesn't solve the problem. The onus has to be on the studio leaders, CEOs and stakeholders. They say you don't quit your job, you quit your boss. So don't be that boss. However, if you are working with a toxic coworker or in a generally negative environment and you've escalated it or you can't escalate it and nothing is being done, I'm going to say something very important to you. It is not up to you to fix it. You deserve to feel secure and enjoy what you do. And if one or more people are ruining that experience, it needs to be resolved. Not being taken seriously means that you need to start to look for a new horizon. You deserve to be heard. This is not a failing on your behalf. This is a failure on behalf of the company to create a positive and safe work environment for you. If anyone takes offence to your leaving, they need to know that jobs only become stepping stones when there's no effort made to make a foundation for success. So a lot of the time, you probably have little impact on who your co-workers are, unless you're directly involved in the hiring process. I will say if you are involved in that process, remember that there is a huge amount of value in actively planning for and hiring diversely. Not just talking about it, actually doing it. Keep track of statistics internally. Data doesn't lie. Not only does having many different team members lend great perspectives for your creative work, but it also allows for an incredible amount of input into your studio culture in ways you might never have considered. However, if you're not involved, you can help keep the space positive in a few ways. So forge some strong relationships. This isn't about finding a clique. It's about making strong relationships with people in the office who are positive and supportive of you and your work. Also, external relationships with people in the industry that you feel you can trust. This doesn't mean that they don't give you useful critical feedback, but they're not interested in putting you down. Maybe you'll get great references out of it, maybe it will help you fix the culture, but the stronger you make those relationships, the more secure you'll feel in getting out of a negative studio culture or working with those people and or management to improve it over time. You need someone to vent to or cry to when you're feeling broken and painful and human and need someone to recognise you as a person. Be as positive and fantastic as you can be. You can't control anyone else's behaviour, but if you are forging forward to be a great influence on the feeling of the studio, you'll often find that not only will it rub off on others, but it means that you have the satisfaction of doing your best with what you have. But know when to get help. There's only so much you can do in terms of managing your relationships with your co-workers. So finally, the one relationship that you will always be dealing with, the one boo you will never escape, is yourself. Everyone's different and is going to have specific individual needs in relation to their studio. So you need to try to understand how best you work, how best you take and give feedback, and gain a strong understanding of your strengths and weaknesses. This can happen naturally over time, but you will need to force yourself to be introspective and reflective, and it can be difficult. Statistically, 1 out of 5 people are coping with some form of mental health issue. This isn't even considering chronic health issues, family issues, or external emotional stress. If you look at your average studio, that's probably going to be a decent portion of your team. And it's not enough to just say, oh, well, if someone comes in and they're dealing with depression, we'll deal with it then and we'll work it out with them. The reality is, a lot of people who have struggled with these things for years may not bring them to your attention because there is still that stigma, or be minimising their own struggles. People are very quick to brush off their own internal feelings and dialogue. So, it's me, a case study. So I have a condition called fibromyalgia, which causes a whole host of random symptoms, including fatigue, nausea, what's called fibrofog, affectionately known in my office as fibrofrog, which has been drawn many a time by our artists, and also affects mental health, so depression, anxiety. I've had to have numerous in-depth conversations where I educate the team on what that's like for me, what I need to be supported, and how I can contribute when I'm not feeling physically or mentally well enough to contribute normally. Because I need to play a part in normalising those discussions. I also need, however, to be making sure that I'm doing everything I can, eating well, sleeping well, minimising stress, taking medications, and recognising when I'm approaching a flare. It's not enough for me to just say, I have a chronic illness and move on. Just as the studio has a responsibility to be supportive and a duty of care, I have a responsibility to do everything in my control to stay healthy. An unsupportive boo in these scenarios would cause absolute havoc for my health. On that note, it's really important that you respect your colleagues' time as well as your own time, no matter your role. People need time away to recharge, relax, and re-energise. Texting them, calling them, emailing them, asking them to send you a file or answer a question is the studio equivalent of the 1 a.m. you up text. Sure, there are exceptions in emergencies, but realistically, almost everything can wait a day. Now, all of this isn't to say it is wholly a studio's responsibility to manage an individual's mental or physical health. At the end of the day, the only person who can manage that is them. But you do have an opportunity to have a clear structure around your support systems, resources, and time away for your team for whatever reason they might need it. We have a detailed section in our studio handbook that discusses mental health, burnout, the impact those things can have, and the value that resources like Checkpoint can have in supporting this. I actively tell our team that we are there to give them the time to manage and understand their own well-being and to support them wherever we have the capacity to. The main thing you need to remember is communication. Communication is the golden ticket to your Willy Wonka factory of support. And it goes both ways. Making a plan with your manager or team is the equivalent of swimming under the chocolate fountain. It's inherently rewarding and delicious, but that's distracting for me, so I'm going to move on. So now that we know a little bit about studio culture, it's my favourite GIF. Now that we know a little bit about studio culture, I'm going to tell you about my boo. So when I started with Ultimerse, like I said, I was in a marketing role initially for about 4 months. Their aim had been to break into the virtual reality market and create something really phenomenal with a quick turnaround. Once I got on board, there were a lot of tough conversations that meant that we changed our scope and realigned a lot of our goals. And we had numerous conversations about this, but very few about the culture of the studio itself. We did, however, have extremely serious conversations about the best flavour of shapes. It's cheddar. Don't at me, people have before, and you're wrong if you think otherwise. And also a week-long bet on how many shapes were in a single box. We counted, it's about 47, which really doesn't feel like enough, at least for me. It wasn't until I started doing some research around studio culture, watching talks and noticing some small issues cropping up within the team that we started to bring it to the forefront of discussion. For previous workplaces, I had never really been in a position to influence the culture beyond being positive and friendly and working as a team. But I realised here I had an opportunity to ensure we had one of the best working relationships and places to work in Melbourne. Because we were working with a very young, small team, their relationships were created off the back of their university experiences. This was their first job, they were still unsure of their skills and feeling like imposters, a huge issue within our industry. And feeling strongly about proving themselves in their roles was leading to clashes between disciplines. Over time, there was a distinct feeling of not being heard. Whether it was in discussions as a team, pitching ideas, a number of different people stated the same issue to us. Rather than implementing a talking stick, we decided we needed to create space where people couldn't be talked over or shut down and ideas would be given the time they deserved. We refined our stand-up, our individual time was given to each team member to speak on what they were working on, what they were waiting on, and had uninterrupted time to speak. We found a scrum that worked for us. Through a lot of work. It felt a little bit like putting a coin on a train line when we did it, especially because we were mid-development. But not only did this small change improve the focus across the team, but it also reduced those feelings of anxiety about trying to be heard. One thing we also looked at was one-on-one meetings with team members, dates, if you will. In a relationship, if you want to keep the magic going, you need to make time for each other to check in closely. Once a month might seem too often, but having yearly reviews is a concept that is crazy to me. So much can happen in someone's life in a year, and if you blink and miss something really tough, you're going to make it even harder for them to come to you next time. If you've managed to set up a culture of honesty and positivity, you'll find people will come to you directly anyway. However, these usually aren't the people to be most concerned about. What often concerns me are the people who are just getting things done, quietly and quickly, not getting the time and energy they necessarily deserve put into their training and support. This doesn't mean that I can protect the team from everything ever. I'm limited in what I can and cannot control within the space, but these were changes that I could make, so I made them. So let's say, for example, we introduced our one-on-one meetings monthly to make sure that we could check in on the physical, emotional and mental well-being of each team member in a private, confidential environment, but we were also able to track what they were wanting to work on and what interests them. This helped us to let them drive their own development, get excited about things, within the scope of working on what can be exhausting, which is the same project for a long period of time. Picture this. You're on a first date and you've spent hours explaining that you want to be a great animator, and your date's smiling and nodding and seeming really engaged. And then you end up in a relationship and 6 months later, they give you a rigging course. Surprise, enjoy. Sure, it's a nice thought, kind of on the right track, but you're probably going to feel hurt and frustrated and not heard. You might even feel like what you want isn't important. As a producer or manager, let your team tell you what excites them, set their own goals, and make sure you guide rather than demand. Something that was hugely important to us was our treatment of and introduction of contractors, freelancers, and part-timers. There's been a culture in our industry for too long of exploiting these individuals. We have had multiple contractors who come in and have said, I'm just going to work on this when I get home, just for a couple of hours, don't worry, unpaid, because they're both aware of how precarious the industry is for those in a full-time position, let alone freelance or contract. We make it clear that those hours are to be logged and tracked and paid accordingly. It's sad that I have to stand up here and state that, or that it's even a bonus on the studio culture side, as it should be the norm. But with an industry as exciting as games, there is always someone who is willing to do it for free. And even worse, there are studios big and small who will accept that and take advantage of it. I don't say this offhand. I've had many conversations and stories that I've heard of this exact scenario. This isn't okay, and this isn't a studio that we should be engaging with. And we should be doing more to name and shame those that do take advantage of that labour until this culture ends, and support those that speak out. The more it is kept a known secret, the more new individuals entering the industry will feel forced and compelled to give value and time away for little to no compensation. The other thing that was massively important to us in the culture was that recognition was noted. As any freelancer knows, your resume is composed of your work, but not having your name credited on a game you worked on, or not being credited until months after the fact, can be a death knell when looking for more work. I highly encourage all studios to keep a tracked list of any and everyone who has contributed to your creative process, as well as adding any relevant individuals to the press kit and providing those who are with you for an extended period of time business cards. It's a small investment on your part that can do wonders for these occasionally transitionary employees. On that note, you should be paid accordingly for your role. This should be an open, honest conversation you can have with your manager at any one time. They should want to build you up. Scope creep is a real problem in games development and in individual roles. You need to be able to negotiate your contract, your rights, without fear of discrimination. In indie studios, you're so often expected to be filling the gaps across whatever role you do, but if you find you're working on more than your original job description, it stands to reason that you should be paid accordingly. If your studio doesn't bring it directly to your attention, you need to be able to bring it to theirs without fear of pushback. Like any couple, you need to be able to communicate openly and fairly, even when it's difficult, especially when it's difficult. Yes, they might not be able to pay you that amount right now, but they need to be able to talk to you about why and how and what they are doing to support your career while you support their business. So after all this, if we think of those original 3 boos, again, who would you pick? It's not number 1. I don't care how cute the dog is. In summary, however, a good studio culture is like a good relationship. It will support you and help you grow. It demands nurturing and is always developing. Some boos can't be helped, and we need to know when to move on by recognising those red flags. It's probably never going to be perfect, but the more we impact it individually, the more we impact studio culture worldwide. So on the note of recognising contributions, you can find the names and Twitters of all of the artists and links I used above, and I am going to post this on Twitter post-talk. I'm sure you're already familiar with a lot of these resources, but I highly recommend them if you're interested in learning more about what we've talked about. I recommend going through the available YouTube channels and finding production, management, and psychology-related talks. There is so much free content online, and it is an absolute lifesaver for you to learn more. I also recommend deep diving into the above websites. But another great resource people forget, each other. Get in touch with someone, talk to someone here in a similar role who's been doing this for longer, and let them help you learn from their mistakes and successes. I also recommend lightly dipping into the Reddit subreddits. However, they're often under-moderated and the information is not always ideally communicated. I personally manage the game production one and always aim to make that a safe space and share any resources that I think are valuable there if you do like discussing on that platform. So I think we have about 5 minutes. Ultimately, you're always welcome to reach out to me on Twitter or via email. I am always happy to talk and to help if I can. But does anyone have any questions with the 5 minutes remaining? Yes?
So with the handbook, how do you manage making sure that everyone's kept up to date with any changes that happen with that?
It's definitely difficult. Ultimately, if you're having frequent conversations with your team in those one-on-ones, you can communicate that then and let them know what a stance is. Obviously, earlier in the year when everything happened with ArenaNet, for example, you need to be ready to communicate to your team what your plan is in a situation like that. Or what the resources are. So I think part of establishing that frequent communication helps with those bigger chunks so that when someone new comes in, you can hand them that and know that they have a lot of information and you can add all the little addendums as you need to because it is always growing. So, anyone else? Cool. Yes?
How do you set up a culture where people can make mistakes and where they know that when they first come in?
I think a big part of it is admitting your own, if you are in a position where you can do so. So if something has happened that wasn't the right call, and especially if another team member notices it, being okay with saying, yep, that was probably the wrong move, and this is what I'm going to do differently in future, and making it a chance for conversation rather than shut down. The second that you take a mistake that someone's made and turn it into a problem, it stops being a mistake and it starts to feel like an attack. So I think you need to be really honest with yourself as well and in how you conduct yourself as a leader. Anyone else?
How do you actively work against crunch culture when, I guess, there are external deadlines?
Yes, crunch culture is a big one. For me, I am great at telling my team to go home and not so good at telling myself to go home. I think it's something that you do need to outline your approach to it. I don't believe that it's something that can never be helped. I think at the start of a project, it should be the first thing that you're thinking about. If you're planning and scoping a project that you know is going to have really tight deadlines, under scope. Make it as small as possible. I try and scope for 3 levels with our team. We have the absolute minimum viable product of everything that has to be in there to get it out the door, what we would like to have, and then kind of the dream. And that tends to motivate the team as well to get through the base level. But yeah, I think if you are crunching, the project was probably overscoped to begin with, and I think some studios are aware of that and just lean into the, it's crunch culture, it happens. Cool. Well, I think we have 3 minutes, so if anyone does want to ask anything else, feel free to come up to me. Otherwise, you're welcome to Vamoose, essentially.